All right, so welcome everyone to this deep dive, and today we're examining the Ukraine conflict 3 years after Russia's full-scale invasion. And, things are getting pretty interesting, especially in the diplomatic realm. We've got articles from Pasted Text and Fox News. We've got statements from UK Prime Minister Keir Starmer and US Secretary of State Marco Rubio. And we even have some very interesting remarks from former US President Donald Trump.
Oh, yeah, it's a really fascinating mix of perspectives, for
Yeah.
sure. Different people see different paths to peace, and some people are even pointing fingers in pretty unexpected directions about the root causes of the conflict.
Yeah, it's definitely a lot to untangle. Maybe we could start with the comments from former President Trump. He's been making some waves, calling Zelensky a dictator and saying that Zelensky rigged elections and is basically incompetent.
Yeah, that's where the global stage gets really interesting. So you have Trump, who also, by the way, claims that Zelensky played Biden like a fiddle. He's bringing U.S. domestic politics into this really complex international situation.
Right. And on the other side, we have UK Prime Minister Starmer. He directly contradicted Trump in a phone call with Zelensky. He reaffirmed his support for Zelensky as a democratically elected leader. Starmer even said that the UK suspending elections during World War II is comparable to what's happening in Ukraine right now. He was directly countering what Trump had to say.
Yeah, and this really highlights those deep ideological divides that exist, even between allies,
Yeah.
When it comes to figuring out how to deal with Russia and navigate this conflict, some people see Zelensky as a strong leader who was democratically elected and who deserves our unwavering support. And then other people view him with more suspicion. And they echo those Russian narratives that say that he's not a legitimate leader.
It's a real clash of narratives, for sure. And Trump doesn't stop there. He says that the war was totally avoidable, and he even suggested that Ukraine is about to collapse if Zelensky doesn't act fast.
I think that kind of rhetoric is especially interesting because it really taps into those anxieties about the potential for things to escalate even further. When Trump says that Ukraine might cease to exist, that could be him trying to pressure Zelensky to try to work out a negotiated settlement. But it also raises some serious concerns about, miscalculations that could happen and the very real risks for everyone involved.
Yeah, well, Zelensky isn't backing down. He came right back at Trump. He said that Trump is being misled by Russian disinformation. He even dismissed what Trump said about his approval rating going way down.
I think Zelensky's response shows how hard it is to fight misinformation, especially in a war zone. Because in a war zone, information itself is a battleground. It also kind of shows how the Ukrainian government is trying to keep morale up and how they're trying to project this image of strength and resilience, both to their own people and to the international community.
It's like a high-stakes perception game. Zelensky also used this opportunity to talk about all the financial and military support that Ukraine has gotten from the U.S. He mentioned $67 billion in weapons and $31.5 billion in budget support.
That level of aid really shows how committed the United States is to supporting Ukraine. But it also makes you think about, whether that support can go on forever and how that aid might actually change the direction of the conflict. Some analysts say that this huge amount of aid might actually make the war last longer. But then others say that it's absolutely essential to stop Russia from being even more aggressive.
Yeah, it seems like there's no easy answer when it comes to that question of aid. And speaking of these complex international relationships, let's look at what Secretary of State Rubio said recently. He said that the U.S. might want to normalize relations with Russia and explore new opportunities to work together.
That could be a pretty big shift in U.S. foreign policy. Trying to have a normal relationship with Russia, even though this war in Ukraine is still going on. That could be a way to try to counter China. China is becoming more and more powerful around the world, so maybe the U.S. wants to pull Russia closer to the West.
Well, that's a big if, though, right? Didn't Rubio also say that resolving the conflict in Ukraine has to happen before there can be any kind of friendly relationship with Russia?
Oh, yeah, absolutely. It seems like the U.S. is trying to walk a really fine line here. They're saying that they might be willing to work with Russia again in the future, but only if the war in Ukraine ends. They're trying to encourage Russia to find a peaceful solution. But they're also keeping the pressure on Russia to stop fighting.
So that brings us to the question of peace talks. And from what I've seen, they seem to be pretty secretive and controversial.
Yeah, that's right. There were reports saying that the U.S. and Russia had been having talks in Saudi Arabia. They're trying to figure out how to end the war. But the interesting thing is that apparently Zelensky wasn't there. And no one even told him about these discussions.
Wait, so the U.S. and Russia were trying to negotiate peace in Ukraine without even including Ukraine? That seems a little strange.
Yeah, it definitely raises some questions. It shows just how complex the geopolitics are. And it shows that the different players often have totally different goals. Some experts say that maybe they left Zelensky out to try to get an advantage in the negotiations, or maybe it shows that there's just a ton of distrust between all the countries involved. Whatever the reason, it makes an already complicated situation even more difficult.
It definitely seems like there's a lot more to this story. Can you tell us a little bit about what they actually talked about in these meetings? What does this potential plan for peace actually look like?
So the plan they came up with has 3 stages. First, there will be a ceasefire. Then they'd hold elections in Ukraine. And finally, they try to come up with an overall peace agreement. But some people are skeptical about whether this will actually work. And they're worried that this is just going to be like other agreements that have failed in the past.
I can see why people would be worried about that. A ceasefire sounds good, in theory, but how do you make sure that both sides will actually stick to it, especially when there's so much bad blood between them and they don't trust each other?
That's a really important point. You have to have ways to make sure that everyone is doing what they're supposed to be doing. Any ceasefire agreement would have to include international observers. They would be there to watch as the troops withdraw, and they would make sure that both Russia and Ukraine are keeping their promises. Without that kind of oversight, a ceasefire could easily fall apart, and the fighting could start up again.
And then there's the problem of trying to have elections in a country that's still basically at war. Zelensky said that he wasn't happy about that part of the plan. He said that no agreement can happen unless Ukraine agrees to it.
Yeah, I think his concerns are totally understandable. Trying to have free and fair elections in a war zone? Well, there are a lot of problems with that. Like, how do you even make sure that people can vote safely? And what about all the people who had to leave their homes because of the fighting? Will they be able to vote? And then there's always the risk that someone will try to interfere with the election. If they want to have elections, they need to plan everything out really carefully. And they need to get help from international organizations to make sure that the election is legitimate.
So even if they manage to get past all of that, and they have a ceasefire, and they have elections, then they still have to figure out the final peace agreement. Is there any information about what that might look like?
There aren't many details out there about that final agreement, but I'm sure that it would have to address some of the biggest issues. Things like making sure that Ukraine's territory is respected and that they have guarantees for their security. And they'd have to figure out what to do with those areas that both Russia and Ukraine claim as their own. The only way that this final stage could work is if both sides are actually willing to compromise. And I don't know if that's really possible right now with everything that's going on.
Especially since Zelensky has made it very clear that Ukraine has to be a part of any peace negotiations, trying to leave him out of it, or trying to pressure him into accepting a deal that he doesn't like. That just seems like a really bad idea.
I agree. Real peace can't be forced on people from the outside. It has to be something that the Ukrainians themselves feel is fair and something that can last. If you try to force a solution that doesn't take their concerns into account, well, it's probably going to backfire and make things even more unstable.
In all this talk about peace plans and negotiations, there's still that question of who's to blame for all of this. Trump has said that Ukraine started the war, but a lot of people have disagreed with him, including some UK officials and even Mike Pence, who was Trump's vice president.
Blaming each other is really dangerous. It usually just makes things worse, and it makes it harder to find a solution. I mean, it's important to understand how we got here. We need to look at the history and the events that led up to the conflict. But just blaming one side or the other is really simplistic. It's a really complicated situation, and I think that everyone involved bears some responsibility for how things are right now.
So you're saying that just pointing fingers isn't helpful, but wouldn't you say that it's important to understand all the different viewpoints about how the conflict started?
Absolutely, even if those viewpoints are controversial. When we look at all of those narratives, it helps us to see why everyone is doing what they're doing. It helps us to understand their motivations and how they see the situation. We're not saying that any one viewpoint is right or wrong. It's just about trying to understand the whole picture. This crisis is a result of historical grievances and geopolitical interests and ideological clashes. It's all tangled up together.
It's like we're trying to put together a puzzle, but some of the pieces are missing, and some of them don't seem to fit. But even though we don't have the whole picture, I think we still need to keep looking for those missing pieces and trying to understand what it all means.
I agree, and that brings us back to the big question of this deep dive. What are the chances that there will actually be peace in Ukraine, and what are the things that will determine how this conflict ends? We've talked about a lot of different perspectives. We talked about the optimistic idea that the U.S. and Russia could go back to having a normal relationship. And we talked about those scary warnings that Ukraine might not survive. We talked about the proposed peace plan and how complicated it is. And we saw how misinformation and blaming each other can make things worse.
Yeah, and we've seen how misinformation and the blame game can make it really hard to find a solution. So where do we go from here? What are the most important things for our listeners to remember as they try to make sense of all of this? I mean, there's so much information out there, and everyone has a different opinion. It seems like we keep coming back to this idea of Ukraine having to give something up. Like, if these peace talks actually go somewhere, is there a chance that Ukraine will get pressured to just give in on certain things? Like maybe they'd have to give up territory or compromise on being a sovereign nation just to make Putin happy and reach some kind of agreement?
Yeah, I think that's a really big worry. And a lot of Ukrainians are definitely thinking about it. I mean, they've been through so much already. They've really suffered. And they've fought so hard to protect their country. If you force them to accept a deal that feels like it betrays everything they'd sacrificed, well, they're going to be angry. And that could make any peace agreement fall apart in the long run.
Yeah, it's got to be a really tough spot for them. They desperately want peace, but they also don't want to be pushed into a settlement that takes away their independence and their land.
Exactly. And that's where the rest of the world really needs to step up. Supporting Ukraine's right to decide their own future. That means not forcing them to give up things they're not ready to give up. It means helping them to negotiate from a place of strength, not from a place of desperation.
But wouldn't giving them more weapons, even though it helps them defend themselves, wouldn't that make the war even worse? And wouldn't that make it harder to reach a peaceful agreement?
It's a tough balance for sure. Giving Ukraine the weapons they need to protect themselves is really important. But we also have to try to find ways to calm things down through diplomacy and by talking to each other. In the end, to create a peace that lasts, we need both military strength and diplomacy.
It's like walking on eggshells. One wrong move could make everything blow up. And then there's the issue of what happens if Russia actually gains something from all of this? Like if they take territory or get what they want by using military force, what kind of message does that send to other countries that might want to do the same thing?
That's a really big concern.
Because if we let Russia get away with it, it might make other authoritarian leaders think that they can do the same thing. And that could really destabilize things on a global scale and undermine the rules that we're supposed to be following. So this whole situation, it's not just about Ukraine, it's about all of us. It's a test of whether we're serious about upholding international law and about whether we're really committed to the idea that every country has the right to govern itself and to decide its own future.
I agree. And it really shows us that peace isn't just about stopping the fighting. It's a lot more complicated than that. Peace is fragile. And we have to work at it constantly if we want to keep it.
It feels like we've only just begun to explore this really complicated issue, but I think we've given our listeners a much better understanding of all the different factors that are at play here.
Yeah, we've talked about the different ways that people see the conflict,
About the diplomacy and all the back and forth between countries,
about the human cost of this war.
and the risks that everyone is facing.
The future is still uncertain, but if people want to really understand what's happening, it's important for them to see just how complicated it all is.
It's a lot to think about, and I'm sure our listeners have a lot of questions. But that's what deep dives are all about, right? They make us question what we think we know. They show us different perspectives, and they make us confront some really uncomfortable truths.
Exactly. And I think the most important thing for our listeners to take away from this is that the situation in Ukraine is changing all the time. The stories are being debated, and we don't know what's going to happen next. So it's more important now than ever to stay informed, to think critically about the information you're getting, and to have thoughtful conversations about all of this.
Yeah, we don't know what's going to happen, but we can educate ourselves so that we can understand this conflict and understand what it means for the whole world. Thanks for joining us on this